Welcome everybody and thank you. I'm just going to focus here for half a second and there. Hopefully the slides are sharing. So again, I'm Dr. Bruce Wallace. My background is engineering, and I'm going to co-present here with my good friend Frank, who comes at this from the medicine standpoint, and we collaborate on all of this research and work. And so what we plan to do is a quick presentation around the supportive smart home, which is a broad research area that we are starting to explore. We think it has huge potential, and then dig into that concept from an ethics law policy perspective, more from a questions we're starting to raise in our own minds about this direction of where research is going and ultimately where it's going for the, in the hands of the aging adults out there. So I'm going to start with a definite, our sort of plan. What is a supportive smart home? Because I've sort of defined a concept. I want to make sure we have a common view, and then we'll dig through ethics, law, policy in order and bring it together in the end. And then we're going to note many of the law and policy considerations also arise on the way through ethics. So we're not going to revisit them in their law and policy. So supportive smart home, why? Our ultimate goal of our research is independence and aging in place. How can we use technology to support people living at home longer, safer, avoiding entry to care, and at the same time, minimizing burden on family caregivers, etc. What is our particular direction we're going? How do we deploy sensors through the home or even doing cars? Sometimes they're worn by the residents, but generally speaking, it's sensors that are just around the house. And then we're using advanced algorithms to analyze that data. Frequently now it's in the cloud. And why do we do it? One, ongoing assessment of well-being and health. Is the person still the same level of mobility, use of the house, kitchen use or whatever as they were 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago? Because if they're declining and we know about it, we can do something about it, right? Ultimately, we're starting to get down the path of supporting independence. And I'll give you an example in the next slide, where we're looking at the knowledge we've got turning into cues and reminders and support for that aging adult. And then lastly, provide knowledge to the formal and informal care team, the care, the family care members, the clinicians, the home care nursing team, whatever. And so the idea here is, and we use the term frequently, is age tech. How are we using technology for aging adults so that aging adults can age in place and be independent? So one example, this is a real system we trialed. Our typical use model case here is a person living with dementia and a care partner. So the care partner could be a spouse, or typically it was either a spouse or an adult child that was caring for mom or dad. The challenge we were looking at particularly was nighttime wandering. The person wakes in the middle of the night because they have to go to the bathroom, but they're disoriented for time or place. And in Ottawa, if you walk outside the front door today in your pajamas, you are in trouble quickly. So it's a risk to the person living with dementia. It's also a risk to the care partner. They go to bed every night sleeping with one eye open. So the idea here is, could we use a supportive smart home to redirect the person living with dementia and literally let the care partner sleep? So the idea, walking through the build, the person living with dementia gets out of bed in the middle of the night. Reality is they probably need to go to the bathroom. Turn the light on in the bathroom. That little visual cue, they'd go to the bathroom, come back to bed, the lights go out. It's a very simple model, but now the home is giving them this feedback. You probably need to go to the bathroom. Here's where the bathroom is. If they go somewhere else in the house, they're probably safe, but we don't want them there. So we would have a smart speaker play, honey, it's the middle of the night, come back to bed. Typically it was in the care partner's voice in first language so that the person would hear and respond. And only if they go to the front door would we go back and wake the care partner, and the results we saw, I cut them out of the presentation. Care partners were getting more sleep. They were less stressed. It was really positive. It really helped. If I look at this data, I'm an engineer. I like looking at data and visualizing it. This is about 12 weeks of the data for one of our houses from the WDD trial, and I've just turned around and presented it. Basically, blue and green means there's nobody home, or everybody is at the house is awake and not in bed. The two shades of blue are very measures of who's in bed. Red is people in the bathroom. Okay, we get a really visual model of this data of what's happening when they're in bed or not, when they're in the washroom or not. This particular house, they go away almost every weekend. You see the greenish yellow bands every weekend. Literally, they went to a child's house. They go to bed about 9 o'clock. They get up about 7. There's a lot of knowledge buried in this data, which leads to questions of privacy. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank here, and we'll start to look at this from an ethical perspective.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us. And just to be clear, I feel a little intimidated by the people that are actually taking part in this session and that are watching. You're probably much more qualified at this than I am. So I am a practicing physician. I do research in technology. I do have some experience, obviously, using these systems. And this is sort of how we have thought about some of the ethical issues, but look very much forward to the discussion afterwards, which will, of course, strengthen all these ideas. So next slide, please. So what I've done is I've sort of looked at, you know, the essence of ethics from these principles, and then sort of said, you know, how can we apply it? How can we see it as a challenge in day-to-day operations of a smart home system? So beneficence, you know, obviously benefit of the caregiver, of the participant. So, and that's the first issue, right? Who is the beneficiary of the technology? So obviously the things that Bruce has talked about, we want our older adults to be physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially safe, and better off because of the technology. But what if the sensors are actually providing more support to the caregiver than to the participant themselves? So if this is more monitoring technology, and like I want to know if my aging parent is eating 3 meals a day, and so I have a sensor on the fridge, is it the benefit to the participant, or is it a benefit for me, the care provider? So there right away we sort of get into that kind of a challenge. Next slide. Of course, we don't want to do harm. And I mean, there's sort of obvious harm. If there's a wire, there's a trip hazard. But what about if our model and we use the Alexa or Siri voice coming out of the speaker, what if they actually scare the older adult? So we're trying to direct them back to their bed, but now we're causing harm in that way. And then there's sort of that indirect harm, which is sort of my personal feeling of harm, or an indirect harm, in the sense that this technology might be visible. So there might be new gadgets in my home, in my condo, and when people come to visit, now they're going, well, what's that? What's that doing there? And it may be like another device that I'm actually not proud of having, right? So I may have a walker, but I try to hide it in the closet most of the time, or I have hearing aids and I don't wear them unless I can fluff my hair over them or something like that. So the visibility of technology may actually limit my inviting people to come to my place. So again, very indirect, but it could be a cause of harm if I decrease my social activities. And of course, autonomy is making an informed, uncoerced decision. And again, so our experience has been great. We test technology, various types of technology in people's homes, and they tell us, this is really great. And you know what? I know a lady who would really benefit from that. But surprisingly, they always say, well, but I don't really need this kind of thing, and probably won't for another 10 years. So choosing the amount of risk to live with is sort of one of those autonomy questions. And again, I said that earlier, like I, as a child, may want to know if mom is eating 3 meals a day, but maybe she doesn't want to worry me or doesn't want me to know. So if autonomy is the ability to say no, thank you, right? So in the end, who has the right or even the responsibility to make a decision about installing technology when we clearly have a benefit? So someone who falls regularly, installing technology that can monitor that, there's a clear benefit, but who gets to decide if it's installed in the home or not? And that, of course, leads to informed consent. And, one of the questions, big questions in this kind of enterprise is always who gets to see the data, so what loss of privacy is there, and that's sort of a big part of the consent. And so one of the questions that we sort of ask ourselves is, how do you assess that risk of breach of privacy? How do you do that? It's hard enough in my clinical practice when I talk about medications. What is informed consent, right? Because any pill I prescribe, there are potentially 152 side effects, but I don't have time in my appointment to go through all of them and talk, about what percentage risk for each one of them there is. So, how do you select out the ones that are relevant? And then in the same way with technology, I mean, how do you describe a 1 in 1,000 or a 1 in a million chance? So informed consent. And that's on a continuum, of course, we talked about the privacy and confidentiality, the ability to sort of keep information private. So different types of technology obviously provide different degrees of information, and hence, sort of that privacy sliding scale, if you like, would be different for the different types of sensors. So clearly a door sensor, which essentially communicates open, closed, open, close, is very different information and much less risk of loss of privacy than a video camera streaming, continuous information. I like this one, honesty, and it's when we talk about used cars, they're always easy to pick on used car salesmen. We can think about, here's a car, it's been in a collision, it has 200,000 kilometers on it, and so we've fixed it, the metal, and we've rolled back the odometer, and now we're going to sell it as nearly new, right? So that's obvious where the degree of honesty is, but going back to my falling older adult, here's a potential that we can respond more quickly. So if you fall and the system can help detect that in a more quick way, you will be less likely to be lying on the floor, and you will be less likely to have more severe morbidity. So we'd like to sell you this. We would really like you to have this, but how do you honestly weigh then, the potential loss of privacy and the perception of loss of autonomy, and honestly represent those? And so that leads to something I've spent a lot of time thinking about clinically, which is sort of trade-off, right? It's not really an ethical principle, but I think it's sort of what we do intuitively, and sometimes without thinking. So I do it without thinking when I spend $100 on buying a pair of shoes, but really I'm trading off the opportunity to spend that $100 on other clothes, spending it on food, rent, vacation, etc. So how do you apply that sort of here? So I thought about the trade-off between being able to get a benefit from the technology sort of in the short term, so the benefit of that, and then trading that off against sort of the loss of privacy. And we've also been thinking about it in even at the level of autonomy is sort of a time-based trade-off where, you know, if I fall and have morbidity, then for the future, I'll be less autonomous. I might not walk as well in the future. So I'm kind of have to decide between my longer term autonomy, because I want to stay mobile for a long time, and trading off maybe a bit of the short term autonomy. You know, I would like to be technology free, but maybe I will now take that technology, sort of doing a time-based trade-off. So just the idea of trade-off. And of course, in the elderly, the big factor that always complicates everything is capacity. And again, that's not necessarily an ethical principle, but obviously in full informed consent is, and then the capacity to understand the informed consent, it becomes an issue. And in the patients that I see and in the participants in our research, you know, capacity is a gray thing. It's not an all or nothing. And it's a gray thing, and it changes over time. So you may be quite capable at the beginning of a 3-year trial, but then your cognition declines and you may be less capable of making decisions subsequently. So each of those ethical principles really has sort of in a matrix model would have to sort of consider the capacity as a variable. And of course, in our work, because there are people that are not capable, and we do research with technology in their homes and with them when they come to clinic and that kind of thing, there's the issue of assent, right? So it's one thing to consent because I understand everything about the technology. It's another thing to say, you know, I don't really want to do this right now, and that's sort of that real-time assent. So that's another dimension. So if there is a speaker in the kitchen and I don't like it there, even though it plays a really important role, then who gets to decide and what we do with that speaker. And then there's the question, sort of on again, in a sliding kind of way between black and white somewhere. You know, what about the very unobtrusive technology? You know, I mean, if they don't really see the speaker, then do we need to worry about assent? I mean, they really won't know they're being monitored, right? So how do you manage that? And then the last 2 pieces are sort of around data. And sort of when we think about data, there's sort of 3 ways or 3 dimensions that I consider. So, or that we've considered. So the first is data that's really unidentifiable. So let's take a door sensor. So there, you know, when we were doing our trial here in Ottawa, we did 19 homes of the wandering detection system that Bruce showed you a little earlier. And so they were little Samsung switches, with a little magnet on it and attached to a door. The door would open and then, you know, there'd be a message, door open, and then you'd close it and be door closed. But it wouldn't actually be door. It would just say this sensor is open and this sensor is closed. And it's actually just by some serial number. So if you hacked into the system, you would see, you know, serial number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is open, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is closed. So what is the risk? Like, is there any, you know, no one knows where that sensor is located because it's bought from Samsung. It's stuck on the wall somewhere. And no one knows what kind of a sensor is. So we don't, even if it was a door sensor that we thought it was, then is it a front door? Is it a fridge door? It could be on a drawer. Is the drawer open or closed? So it's really not providing any information. So, you know, so there's data that's virtually got nothing attached to it. But of course, there's a lot of data as well that does have, you know, personal information attached to it. So, and there's sort of two versions of that. One is sort of the data that's streaming, at any given time. Right now, there is data streaming to the cloud from Richmond Retirement Home, where we have a set of systems that are very much like the ones that we had in the home that you saw earlier. So that data is real time, but there's also historical data. So we like to compare how things were before. And then there's other clinical data that sort of can be extracted from it, and then that can be stored. So there's sort of both of these dimensions, the real time and the aggregate. So who controls access to the data? How is that access monitored? And what about service providers, right? So the TELUS might be transmitting the data from the home to the cloud. What's their responsibility? Then it might be IBM that stores the data for us. Well, what's their responsibilities? And then there's data, which is sort of the big data piece. So, we at Carleton have a large, very large database of databases. And, so there are tons and tons of information there. There is clinical databases like ICES that brings together bits and pieces of data from various sources. So who owns that? Who's responsible for that? Who gets to decide who accesses that? I mean, obviously ICS has rules around that, but let's just say that I want to sell my smart home system. So am I allowed to access data on the incidence of dementia in a particular community? Can I access data on the average household income in that community and the average household data use for that community? Because if they have an incidence of dementia and they can afford the system and they're already users of the internet, this might be where I want to sell my product. So again, the ethics and data there. So that's my part. Back to you, Bruce.
Bruce, I think you're muted.
There, the problem was the toolbar had ended up underneath other Zoom windows. So there, I found it. Yes, so if we start and dig into the policy questions, as we transition from ethics, right? And one of the things I'm starting to think about here when we're looking at policy, it's one thing to think about how we structure a research study using a supportive smart home. So it's, it's in the house for 3 months and it's out. There's much more broader questions if we start asking the question, okay, this system actually works and we want to put it in thousands of houses because it's actually not a research study anymore. It's a commercial offer in some form that can help lots of people live independently as they go forward. So, so this leads us to questions we're starting to think about in terms of these age tech space. Frank sort of alluded to it with, socioeconomic questions. There's the question of the equitable distribution. If age tech becomes a model, and this gets into government policy of what gets paid for, if age tech actually proves to be something that allows people to live at home longer, safer, and it's only accessible for people in upper socioeconomic classes or people that live in cities, or pick any other distinction, there's some real challenges that get brought up that we need to think about as we head down the path in socioeconomic and age tech, equity. And there's a whole other question around age tech, which we as a team haven't had any time to really dig into, which is the cultural questions that come up, whether it's First Nations and how the tech fits with different cultural norms and foundations, different immigrant populations. There's a bunch of interesting questions there, right? Which also introduces, and I know this is a conversation we regularly end up with various participants in our studies, because when they participate in a study, we give them the tech for 6 months. But then you get into the interesting question, which is who pays for it? And in a publicly funded healthcare system, age tech gets perceived by the population often to be healthcare stuff. So we're in Ontario, should no HIP pay for it? so it leads to these questions, and that is closely tied to that socioeconomic urban rural. If it's paid for by the payer, the provincial payer, then everybody can have access to it. If it's paid for by the user, then suddenly you're going to have an affordability, who can afford it, and where does it fit? And it's got huge implications on the age check. We're seeing systems, where it can help the person age in place, the family's happier because the person, their mom or dad hasn't gone into care. If the tech also reduces the burden on the family and the care partners, they don't burn out. Maybe we can even let them continue to work, because a lot of care partners end up reducing work hours or not work because they're caring for a family member. So there's huge economic positives that can come out of it. But there's some policy considerations of where, when does age tech become part of funded healthcare? There's a whole other question that is coming out of automated health data. If we start having thousands of houses that are recording this data, and we're getting what's now truly automated health data, we have thousands of people where we're now getting well-being measures, okay? Then you get into the question of who's dealing with that data from a clinical assessment. So I sort of, the third bullet I talk about is looking for the needle in the haystack. Thousands of houses. 9,999 of them are the same as they were last week and 3 months ago. Who cares? One of them, the person is showing a significant change. So there's some really interesting questions about, if we identify a change, first of all, there's a technical question. Did we get the identified change right? But there's also an accountability question. Who deals with it, right? Who's responsible for intervening if that change is identified? Because obviously there's a change in somebody. Intervention is important to take care of the person. That's the point of this. Okay. Some law considerations. Frank alluded to a few of them on the way through. We've got a lot of questions, or, we've got a lot of responsibility around privacy, PIPEDA being, one of the examples of legislation around privacy. But there's some interesting questions that I'm struggling with in my own thinking, which is, when does the data from a smart home, supportive smart home system actually become medical data in the definition of PIPEDA, right? If we're just talking about a security system, it's not medical data. That's our normal world. If I take a security system, smart home system, and start using it for well-being measures and knowing what's going on in a house from an activity level, I'm sliding towards health data. If I get into some more personal measures, I test everything I talk about on my own house. I have a toilet upstairs in my house, and I know every single time it's been flushed because I have a sensor in it. Okay, we're getting fairly intrusive here. Now, if we add more measures, what happens if the sensors are actually pulling apnea, heart rate, respiration rate, truly things that could be considered vital signs or sensor or medical assessments? So if the system's gathering it, and then you get the question of who gets told if this data is being shared with a home care nurse. Okay, so when did this data become health data, and when does PIPEDA, the type rules, come into play, is a really interesting question. And it's got a close cousin, which is, when does this technology become a medical device? Okay, I have a pulse oximeter literally on my desk in front of me. It's a medical device, no argument. Okay, if I put an Apple Watch on my hand, it can also tell me heart rate. It's actually not considered a medical device because it's a fitness monitor, right? So there's this dance in the consumer electronics between these two definitions. Well, if we start using consumer, how things deployed in the house to actually measure vital signs, when does it become a medical device? And the example I would give you, we are doing some advanced algorithmic work right now where literally we can pull heart rate off a skin tone. So it's a video camera. I could do it on a Zoom call if I wanted to, and a whole bunch of really cool background software. So now what's the medical device? Is it the camera? Is it the software? Is it the camera and the software? Is it the whole structure? And is it even a medical device? So there's a lot of questions that we're starting to think about as this stuff goes forward. So in summary, we see this supportive smart home as this huge potential to enable us to live in our homes as we age. As I said, I test everything on my house. I will be honest, I have 7 smart home systems in my home because COVID has forced me to move my lab home. Okay, I test everything on myself. I also know everything that goes on with my kids, right? So there's this huge potential of what we can do with it, both positive and negative. And if I start thinking about these types of systems deployed widely on a more commercial basis, it starts to introduce, like, consumer tech and smart home is now becoming health tech. And where is the crossover? So with that, I am going to wrap up and turn it over to, I guess, Catherine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bruce and Frank. That was fantastic. So now I'm going to hand it over to Krista.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, first of all, thank you for this invitation. It's been fascinating listening to Frank and Bruce talk about their work. I'm a lawyer by training, but a lot of my work is interdisciplinary, and I find it's always really interesting to see how it affects our thinking about a problem if we bring to a question people with lots of different kinds of experience and expertise. So I love getting outside of the lawyer box. I actually it's fun too to be presenting to folks sort of in Ottawa, because that's where I did my undergraduate in philosophy, studying in the Faculty of Law building there. So I feel like I'm virtually kind of coming home a little bit. So I work for an organization called the Canadian Centre for Elder Law. We are part of a nonprofit called the British Columbia Law Institute, and we are independent of government. And what we do is look at legal and policy issues linked to aging. Like a lot of the folks out listening, I think, are academics. We like you, we secure funding for projects from foundations, from governments, to do research that we think could propel elder law forward. So like you, we have to always rationalize if our work is in the public good and that it's worthwhile to do some of this research. So I think that I've been invited to share some of my thoughts because all of my work involves thinking about how legal and policy issues impact older people and impact all of us as we age. And I don't have very impressed with Frank's bow tie. I don't have a bow tie, but I do have my Alzheimer's Society Forget-Me-Not, which I like to wear when I'm talking about issues impacting people living with dementia, because it does remind me that I need to always be thinking about the experience of the person living with dementia and what they would think about the question that we're looking at, to make sure that their voice is kind of as front and center as possible. I think now that I've heard Bruce and Frank talk, I think that if I was planning this panel, I would have invited a fourth person to this panel, and that would be a person living with dementia, to hear what their thoughts are as they're aging with dementia and what kinds of technology they would find welcome or interesting or concerning. But I'm going to do my best to try and bring their voice to the discussion. So when I think about the kind of smart technology, I'm interested in some of the questions that Frank is interested and that Bruce is interested in. I think about, who does this technology serve or benefit? Who is the client who purchases or rents this technology or uses it? Who provides consent to use of this monitoring technology? Who owns the data acquired through monitoring, and who has a right to access it and use it? I'm also wondering, is it an older person purchasing this technological service so they can live at home in comfort and security? Or is someone else who cares about them seeking to install this technology so they can have reassurance that the older person is safe? And I think this is an important distinction to keep in mind, because things that enhance quality of life for people who love people living with dementia do not always enhance quality of life for people living with dementia. Older people are independent adults with their own rights to make choices about how they want to live. This technology raises so many legal and ethical questions, and I've just mentioned a few that are of interest to me, but I could see that it would lead to others. So we all have a right to privacy. We generally have a reasonable expectation of privacy in our own homes, right? Our homes are some of the most private places in the world, and we go to our homes to escape the gaze of everyone else. Some forms of technology would probably violate provisions of the criminal code unless there was agreement of the person being monitored. We're talking, I was interested to hear Frank's description of some of the kinds of technology that he's using. And I just want to remind you that we have voyeurism provisions, for example, and they don't just protect us from sexual surveillance. They protect our right to be naked in our own homes without cameras, so we can do whatever we feel like doing with our bodies and the people we want to interact with in our own homes. And there are so many ways that our quality of life can change if we are being monitored. It's not just sex, but I think it is worth reminding everyone that old people have sex with other people, and they also pleasure themselves by themselves. And they are not just baking cookies, gardening, and watching television in their own homes. And obviously, like, the implications of technology has so many implications beyond managing or having an impact about how older people live their lives as sexual beings looking for pleasure. But I think it's important we don't sexualize older people and forget that they may want to have sex in their homes, and a heart monitor is going to impact what their family members know about their sort of personal lives. We also generally have a freedom to move about in the world and community unless we are legally restrained to do so in some way. And these rights don't go away just because we become older or frail or develop complex health needs and disabilities that create greater risk of falls and harm. Use of technology without consent of people living with disabilities could also violate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons Living with Disabilities, of which Canada is a signatory, and includes a right to liberty, autonomy, dignity, and independence. I'm not going to go too much into detail about specific legislation in my talk, because I imagine there's people listening from across the country, and so many aspects about how consent, capacity, privacy is monitored really falls under provincial and territorial legislation. We're in a lovely federal country. So I'm going to focus more on some general themes, but I did want to flag some legal instruments that are valid across the country. And I think international human rights law is something we need to think about in terms of how these technologies are applied to manage the lives of people living with disabilities, including dementia. We retain the right to live with as much risk as we want, as long as we understand what is going on and can make informed decisions. This is what the law says. This idea is grounded in, decisions about risk should be grounded in what matters to us, not what matters to other people, even if that makes younger people around us uncomfortable. A lot of what gives life meaning is the ability to choose what we do with our lives and what kind of choices, what kind of risks we are comfortable with. Elder law is full of stories of younger folk trying to control older people from a very well-meaning, life-preserving perspective and make choices about what kind of situations are safe for them. And that approach to thinking about the lives of older people can be very paternalist and ageist and often not welcome to older people. For many of us, safety is not an absolute measure of quality of life. The ability to choose what risks we are comfortable with is part of what it is to have a meaning-rich life and be self-determining. Often we want to keep older people safe because we love them. But protective measures come at a cost of freedom and joy. And I think it was interesting to hear Frank doing a bit of a utilitarian analysis of balancing good versus benefit and losses versus quality of life. Who's getting the overall benefit to these tech? And I think it's very important in thinking about that this is managing the life of an older person or a person with a disability. And our analysis of benefit really should be centered on the experience of that older person. the benefit and burden on older people on younger people, to me, that is somewhat of a peripheral factor. Because how we think about this technology needs to be centered on the experience of the person who is being managed by this technology. The alternative has a bit of a kind of a lot of Brave New World connotations about what kind of power we give other people, or we don't give, but other people claim about how they control our lives. And to see this dynamic playing out, I think we need to look no further than pandemic long-term care policy. Many older people would have chosen to live at risk of COVID exposure rather than live for months with no visitors and no hugs from people they care about. You gotta remember that people living in long-term care are often, the average life expectancy is 18 months, and we now have a pandemic that's gone for more than 2 years. I think what we see with pandemic policy is a heavy orientation toward protecting older people. And protecting older people does reflect a certain amount of value for their lives. And I think that can be an important factor, but we need to make sure that our policy and ethical and legal analysis of how we use technology isn't heavily leaning toward protection at the expense of a significant loss of quality of life. I think a lot of older people living in long-term care for the past 2 years who have survived this pandemic would say that the trade-off was not worth it. And I know we're not talking about COVID today, but I think that the COVID policy shows us a little bit how we can get down a dangerous path when we use protection and safety and injury prevention as our overarching concern. So now I want to look a little bit more at provincial and territorial legislation that would apply to thinking about using this technology to manage seniors, and what is possible under the current legal framework that we have in Canada. So the use of monitoring technologies requires consent from the person with legal authority to use it. The thing that I see over and over again when I speak to researchers and others is that very smart people assume one or both of the following. First is that people living with certain diagnoses like dementia cannot make their own decisions about, say, living alone, driving a car, using an oven, going on dates and making new friends. And the second thing is that if a person has dementia or some other kind of decision that impacts their ability to make choices or understand information or remember things, then boom, their family member, whether it's their spouse, their adult child, other children, has the legal right to make decisions for them. And we do this sort of switch happens. If the person with dementia has trouble, the family member decides. And both of these assumptions are false. So I want to talk a little bit about decision-making law for healthcare and for other contexts, because not all smart technology is going to be healthcare. Many people living with dementia can make their own decisions and provide informed consent. And I just feel like as a legal researcher, it's important to say this over and over again. Many are capable of independent decision-making. Some folks can make their own decisions, particularly if the conditions, the right conditions are present, such as conditions that support optimal decision-making and minimize trauma and stress, quiet environments, minimizing noise, bells going off, everybody speaking in plain language and not using abbreviations or jargon. All these things can support a person living with dementia to understand what's going on and make an informed decision for them about what they want in terms of healthcare or technology. For many of them, people living with dementia, support with decision-making from people they trust and who don't have their own agenda can support them with making an informed decision about technology. And just to build on what Frank has said, sometimes there's, I think you said 156 negative potential side effects of a medication that we need to support folks to have robust, informed consent. What people often experience when they're living with dementia is the ability to have a 7-minute conversation with a physician that doesn't really support robust consent. And often people are going home and making informed consent based on Google searches, because that's the only way they can get information about medication. I think that I understand that physicians can't always go through all the 150 side effects, but I would say that physicians often need to do better, and that leaving people to Google the possibilities is an abdication of responsibility and kind of leaves people hanging, particularly people who have cognitive disabilities. So some people living with dementia can make their own decisions, and some people with dementia cannot make their own decisions, but that does not mean, if they cannot make decisions, that there's going to be anybody else with legal authority to make that decision for them now or in the future. So decision-making law is within the jurisdiction of the provinces and territories. Some provinces and territories have substitute decision-making laws that apply to some areas of decision-making, and some do not. Most have different kinds of substitute decision makers with different kinds of authority, and they are all called different kinds of things. And that's partly why some of my work is important. It's really hard to understand in different instances who has authority to make different kinds of decisions. And just to make things extra confusing, substitute decision makers for healthcare and personal care have different titles in the different provinces and territories. Sometimes a person with the same title has different powers in other jurisdictions. And just to give you an example, I expect a lot of people on the call, having scanned through the names, are in Ontario or BC. In Ontario, you can have a power of attorney for personal care who makes healthcare decisions for you, and that might apply to some kinds of smart tech. But in British Columbia, an attorney under a power of attorney has no authority to make decisions about healthcare or personal care. They can only make decisions maybe about paying for that care, because a power of attorney is a document in British Columbia that covers financial and legal decision making. So I say all this to let you know that healthcare decision-making law is rife with confusion, and each jurisdiction has its own rules and laws, and it's very important for people who are working with this tech, who are selling this tech, who are making money off this tech, to be aware of the right legislation and following the legislation that governs practice in your jurisdiction. And this gets especially confusing if your practice is national. You really cannot come up with rules and policies based on Ontario legislation and apply that across the country. And I would say further, just to give us folks a mini kind of tutorial on constitutional law in Canada. Federal law doesn't apply everywhere in Canada. So often, if we're not legally trained, it makes perfect sense to think that the personal information and the PIPEDA, one of the laws that Bruce mentioned, personal information and Protection of Electronic Information Act. It's a big law, a big title. It's federal, but that doesn't mean it applies everywhere in Canada. That means it applies to federally regulated industries, such as banking. Healthcare is, for the most part, not federally regulated. It's regulated by the provinces and territories, and certainly healthcare decision-making law is provincially regulated. And privacy law that applies to health information is also governed by provincial and territorial law. So unless you're a bank selling smart tech, federal legislation is really not the legislation you need to concern yourself with. So some older people might have done advanced planning and legally appointed a substitute decision maker for health and personal care. Most people will have not, some people will have. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. For folks who have not chosen a health or personal care decision maker, and they could be called different things, right? This could be a proxy in some provinces, an attorney in some jurisdictions, a representative. Like, there's lots of different names. For folks who have not chosen someone, then who is going to make decisions for you about smart tech if you do not have the ability to make a decision for yourself? Well, that's going to depend on with this smart technology is healthcare. Is it a form of healthcare treatment? And I think that's not clear to me. And I certainly say we cannot say that all smart tech is a form of healthcare treatment. I think it's probably arguable that some kinds of smart tech are an extension of healthcare treatment. They are a way for a healthcare provider to provide certain kinds of treatment. Maybe a monitor for heart rate, for example, blood pressure. Maybe that's a kind of healthcare in which, if that is the case, then if a person hasn't chosen someone to make healthcare decisions for them in advance, then healthcare decision-making law in the province and territory would apply. And what that generally means is that if you can't make decisions for yourself, a next of kin, each province is different, but there's a default list, right? It's probably going to be your spouse, or as was mentioned in this call already, an adult child might have the ability to make a decision about purchasing and applying smart tech that provides healthcare to you in your home, even if you can't make that decision for yourself because you're a person living with dementia. But a lot of smart tech is not providing healthcare. Some of this monitoring or surveillance maybe has an intention of improving well-being and safety, but that does not make it healthcare. And if it's not healthcare, then healthcare laws do not give family members the ability to make decisions to consent to this treatment. So who consents? In most cases, what it's going to mean is that if a family member wants to make decisions about smart tech for a person living with dementia, they're going to have to go to court and get a guardianship order and establish for a judge that that person doesn't have consent, pay all the money, go to court, get a guardian, and then as a guardian they can make all these decisions for a person living with dementia. But guardianship is pretty rare. Folks rarely do that. It costs a lot of money and a lot of time. But I think it's really important that we don't assume that just because a person living with dementia cannot make decisions about smart tech, that a family member will have legal authority to make that decision. I think often they will not. So I'm going to come back to consent in advance. Consent in advance is a hot topic for people living with dementia. We want to be able to consent in advance, for example, to medically assisted dying, and that's not possible under our Canadian legal framework. Some provinces and territories, most of them have created some kind of ability to consent in advance to healthcare, but not to smart tech. And I would think that it's pretty difficult to consent in advance to healthcare that is linked to smart tech because technology is an ever-evolving area, and what is required for advanced healthcare directives to be valid for physicians or others to follow is that the person who created this document, say the person living with dementia, is able to understand and grade the detail, their situation, the technology, and make an, as Frank brought up, an informed decision about this tech. And in most cases, providers of tech are not going to be reassured that the person living with dementia understood all the context and the nature of the invasion on their privacy in order to make that kind of informed decision. I haven't seen any litigation about that question, but you can imagine that people living with dementia are not going to court a lot. There are all sorts of barriers to them providing informed consent, hiring lawyers and agreeing to pay them. But advanced consent is not going to be a panacea to using smart tech. Monitoring older people will raise a slew of questions regarding how data is stored and who has access to data and when it must be destroyed. It also raises concerns about how private corporations have access to this kind of sensitive, potentially sensitive personal information, whether it's health data or not. And I have honestly not done research on the topic of storing and accessing this data, but I think we should not be naive about the kind of power we give self-interested corporations when we grant them access to our personal data. I read a lot of science fiction novels, and many of them provide a powerful reminder of how privacy is key to freedom, lots of freedoms, and information is a powerful method of control. We may need to look to our privacy commissioners for guidance, privacy commissioners in the provinces and territories, for guidance in developing ethical protocols and best practices. Some of what either Frank or Bruce said reminded me that many of the companies that will be selling us this technology are owned outside of Canada, like IBM or some of the Asian companies that were mentioned today. And I think that kind of raises other challenging questions about where this data is stored and who owns it and what kind of legislation governs its use. Ultimately, I think smart technology opens up a Pandora's box related to consent, substitute decision-making, and privacy. In some cases, it would be possible to get consent from a person with legal authority to use this technology. But businesses providing this technology, particularly those they're in multiple provinces and territories and states, will need to be careful to understand and follow the appropriate legislation so that this use of technology isn't effectively violating criminal privacy and healthcare and other legislation, or just exceeding the authority we give people under law to manage the lives of people with disabilities. In delivering this kind of technology, I think we also need to be careful they do not become tools of control for older people and people with disabilities. Monitoring that undermines quality of life and freedom may not be worth the investment, at least in the eyes of people living with dementia. Monitoring without the knowledge of an older person is particularly problematic. And you can imagine a scenario where the person living with dementia had the capacity to consent to this technology being used in their home at a certain point. But what about when their capacity declines? Or what if they have a bad day and they don't realize they're being surveilled and they do things in the privacy of their home that they wouldn't want other people knowing about? The fact that dementia is an evolving condition raises questions about the ability of people living dementia to provide ongoing informed consent to its use. Not to be an absolute naysayer, I think it's tricky to do things in a way that's consistent with the law. It's also difficult to make generalizations about all smart tech, and the ethical concerns are greater the more invasive the technology is. Obviously, a video camera would raise more concerns than a heart monitor. There is no point in keeping folks alive if they cannot do the things that they love and live with dignity. And technology can be a human victory of intelligence and ingenuity. But to me, it should also be a reminder that just the fact that we can do something does not mean that we should do something. And again, I don't want to sound like an absolute naysayer about using this technology. There are, older people that I love and care about and want to keep safe. But personal information and our private lives are really critical to, self-determination and well-being. For example, my father is 80 years old, and he's had a stroke. He was riding a motorbike till about a year ago. A lot of people in the family wanted him not to ride that motorbike, and we didn't stop him until we never stopped him. But he did have an accident, and then he stopped using that motorbike. It just didn't kind of work, given the prior low damage he'd had experienced. But he got a lot of joy out of that motorbike. I'm working with him to get him on an electric bicycle now. But that loss has a big impact on his life. And I think for a long time I was the only family member who was saying, we can't say Dad can't use this bike. It had to be his choice about when he was using this bike, because at that point he wasn't putting any other folks at risk. And now, you know, he still snowboards and plays hockey. He has other ways to make choice about risk, and there's still things he's doing that other folks are uncomfortable with. But it's not our role to manage his life. And I do not have a right as his loving daughter to call his doctor and ask if it's okay for him to ride that bike or play hockey. Just like we don't have ability to consent for other folks while they are able to consent for themselves, family members do not have unequivocal right to access to the private information, the private healthcare information of older people. And this is, you know, this is a right that I think is really important to respect and protect. So thank you so much. Those are sort of the basics that I wanted to kind of put out there to support our conversation on this topic. And I want to thank you so much for allowing me to kind of share my views, because it's really led to thinking about other questions. And I can see us going down a path of, you know, thinking some more about these uses of these technology, of course, always in consultation with people living with dementia and other people who could potentially be monitored or sort of benefit from this technology. And again, always put benefit in quotes, because keeping people alive, they are keeping them alive, is not always a benefit. So thank you so much. I look forward to questions and hearing what other people's thoughts are.
Thank you so much, Krista. That was very enlightening and fantastic. So now we're going to transition into the Q&A portion. So I don't know if Frank and Bruce, if you'd like to turn on your cameras as well. And I invite all of the attendees who are in this series, if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to do so using the Q&A feature. And then as they come in, I will just field them to our fantastic guest speakers. And with that, we actually already have one question set to go. So this question comes from Dornia, and they're asking, can you talk about how well including smart home tech can prevent admission to hospital and long-term care? What are the policy implications of this? So I don't know who wants to take that on first.
I can start. I mean, you know, from a clinical point of view, that's the whole point, right? I mean, the reason we've been thinking about this technology is to prevent readmission to the hospital. In fact, when I first thought about smart homes for the elderly 15 years ago, and I got my first little grant, I was in geriatric rehab. I had, you know, a lot of patients that had hip fractures. They had some cognitive issues. They had some, you know, medical issues, and they broke their hip. It was fixed, but then afterwards they don't just sort of get up and walk again. So we do the rehab. Now they're walking, sort of safely. They have had some further cognitive decline because of anesthetic and all the, you know, drugs, the heavy medications they've had for pain and whatever. And, you know, and their heart's not quite as stable. And so, you know, so now they're going home and they forget that they're not supposed to eat chips, and they get, you know, go into heart failure, or they don't remember to use their walker. So all of these things, you know, and I'm discharging these people back to the community, and the person saying, I'm going to my apartment, and the kids are not, you know, not having a vote on this. And so that's where the idea came from, right? Can we use the technology to ensure that they're maintaining their independence and to delay the next event? Because if they aren't using their walker and they're getting weaker and they're going into heart failure, there is a high likelihood that they will get admitted to a hospital again. So you know, so that it sort of opens that question of is, you know, if we are able to delay or prevent hospitalization, or if we are able to delay or prevent long-term care admission, who has the vested interest now, right? I mean, obviously it's the person, you know, the person probably doesn't want to go to the hospital. They probably don't want to go into long-term care. But for the greater good, you know, for the payers, which is all of us, taxpayers, right? We have a vested interest in them not going into long-term care and not getting into the hospital as well. So again, that goes to, you know, that kind of balance between, you know, who's benefiting, right? Who's benefiting? I mean, ultimately, everyone would be benefiting by not having the person admitted to a hospital. But you know, but then who decides and who gets the benefit or the downside of that decision? I don't think there's an answer, but it's certainly one of the questions that we think about.
I think just to extend it, because it's part of Doreen's actual question, which is, AgeWell did a survey, and 7 out of 10 Canadians said they were interested in the option to buy technology to allow them personally to age in place. So now it's where they're making their own decisions. So that's sort of the path we're heading. We're heading down is thinking about it. How do we put that option on the table so people can make the decision for themselves?
So I'm going to jump in a little bit, and I want to, I think, so continuing consent matters to me. I think, people say in advance they want tech, but I think that does that consent continue if they don't always know they're being surveilled is a question that I think is important. We aren't reassured by that because they consent in advance. We can't consent in advance to something that sort of continues forever. At some point, then there always has to be somebody able to consent. So maybe then the ability to consent shifts. But I'm so glad that Frank mentioned potato chips, because my dad has. I'm gonna come back to my dad, who has high blood pressure. Everybody's always trying to get him to stop eating chips. My dad loves chips. Chips, cheesies. I cannot tell you how much joy my dad gets from eating potato chips. And he's managed to live to be 80 eating potato chips. And my worst case scenario would be that he agrees to smart tech and thinks, oh, that's good, I can live for a longer time. But then he stops having the ability to consent for himself at some point. And then my sister is driving the show, and she doesn't want to let my dad eat chips. And every time the camera shows him eating chips, somebody goes and takes the chips away from him or stops him from eating chips. Like, these are small things, but they add up to quality of life, particularly when you're older and you can't do all the other things you used to be able to do. And I think part of letting people live in dignity is to let them make choices that can put them at risk, even of heart failure. So chips are small, but in a way, they're both literally significant to me in my personal experience with an older person in my family, and also these small things do matter. And I think the other thing that matters to me when we're thinking about these questions, I think we should need to think about these questions about whether surveillance is important in the context of our overall planning and services for supporting people to live in their homes. We've had over the years, in a lot of provinces, a loss of home support and other kinds of in-person care that help people to live in their homes. And right now, nobody wants to go to long-term care because they're in a pandemic, and long-term care homes have become even more terrifying. But I think that the fact that long-term care is terrifying, I think we need to think in a broader way about how we keep living at home possible for people through our public policy choices. And the technology is one of the many options, but there are other things available, and we need to make sure that a whole range of stuff is available to us so we can live really good lives at home as we age.
Perfect. Okay, thank you all so much. So the next question is from Josephine, and they say, I would like to know what legal differences Krista sees between people living with dementia in their homes versus those who are institutionalized, i.e. unable to make informed consent related to monitoring technologies. For those institutionalized, staff will justify surveillance technology use as safety related for PLWD and others, but not treatment. Can substitute decision makers make decisions about the use of that technology in institutions if it's not a health treatment?
That's a really interesting question, Josephine. So again, some people living in long-term care, whether they have dementia or not, are going to be able to make choices about how they want to live and what kind of healthcare or non-healthcare related surveillance is acceptable to them. I think long-term care facilities are often businesses, and they can decide what kind of services they want to offer and what kind of treatment is part of it. So I think in some cases, if a family or a person does not want any kind of granny cam or any kind of surveillance in their experience, then they would have to choose to not contract to live in a facility that insisted or provided like those services in that room. You know, you have the ability to you can, you know, often there's not enough choice about facility, but facilities cannot secretly surveil you without your knowledge or knowledge of whoever is consenting, but they may be able to provide some restrictions on the nature of the care that they provide. And so you might choose not to be living in that kind of facility. Can substitute decision makers make decisions about the use of technology institutions if it is not healthcare treatment? The answer to that question is maybe. Like, I think it depends on what kind of legal authority that family member has. Did the older person sign a document giving them authority before they lost the ability to consent for themselves? Does that family member have a guardianship order by a court? If these things have happened, it's more likely that yes, they could provide consent to use of technology. But in the absence of that, I would say no. You need legal authority to consent to a non-healthcare based surveillance. But I do think generally we assume family members can do that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Krista. So next question here. Bruce mentioned some benefits for caregivers using the supportive smart homes, like decreased anxiety and increased sleep time. What were the benefits for those people with dementia? What outcomes were examined for the older adult?
So I'll let Frank answer this also in addition to mine. So in that study, when we looked at the data and how we were looking at it, there were sort of two perspectives. One was the person living with dementia safe, right? So and it was a very high level observation, which was the interesting thing in the study. And all of the homes collected, the person living with dementia never actually went through the proverbial front door to try to leave their residence, right? So that, a lot of the worry about nighttime wandering is truly the person going out the front door. So from that standpoint, we looked at the data. We have looked at the data from the standpoint of, nighttime behaviors of the individual. Did the person get up from bed, go to the bathroom, or go directly to bed? And as a result, sort of, I'll call it improved sleep, in that they didn't wander off and do other things. So I'll let Frank continue from there because it's more clinical now.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole point was to guide, the system was to guide the person with dementia to the bathroom and preferably back to bed, right? And not to have too many other activities happening. And if the other activities happen during the night that, for instance, I go and boil some water or something, then the risk of leaving the stove on. So the idea is then, for them to be safe and to come back. So those questions are actually really hard to answer from a research point of view. But what I can tell you is that we did look at the data for 8 of our homes, and we looked at did the system appear to guide the person in some way. So the first question was, in week 1, how many times did the person end up going directly to the bathroom? And it was about, and don't quote me on this, I do have slides, but they're just not handy right now, but we'll say somewhere 60-some% of the time the person went to the bathroom first, and then they obviously went elsewhere in the home first otherwise. Interestingly, after 6 weeks of the system being in the home, 98% of all getting out of beds ended up going immediately to the bathroom. So I mean, we can't ask the person with dementia, did this system help you? But we did find, certainly in this small, and it's a small study, but over 400 nights of data, where did you end up going? And so that seemed to be positive. On the other hand, interestingly, the speaker did not seem to change behavior as much. And there are a lot of issues around definitions and things, but our definition was the speaker goes off. 3 minutes later, is the person back in bed or not, right? And so, is 3 minutes the right window? There's all kinds of research questions, but for the sake of argument, we did it in week 1, and it was just over half that would respond to the speaker and go back to bed within 3 minutes. After 6 weeks, it was still just about half that went back to bed. So it didn't appear that there was a difference from week 1 to the last week. What would have happened if there was no speaker? How long would they have stayed in the kitchen or the other room? We don't know. And so this is sort of the tricky thing with field work, is that, unless you have the sensors in the home before they're working or before they're giving a cue, and you sort of collect the baseline data and then look and turn on the system and see how that changes, it's tricky. So we think that it made a difference for the person living with dementia as well, at least from a guidance and sort of nighttime behavior point of view. But it's actually quite difficult to measure.
I'm going to just jump in briefly, because I just don't think that Bruce and Frank have answered the question. To me, I think the question is, how is it improving quality of life for people living with dementia? And I think that we can study that. I think it's possible to do qualitative research, do baseline research on how people living with dementia are doing before, in terms of their emotional state, their anxiety level, their eating, how much they're sleeping, that kind of stuff. Like, come up with different measurements, ask them how they're doing. We don't have to ask them how they feel about the tech, but just how they're doing. And we can measure, and then we can monitor how they respond to that, and we can make inferences on how the technology is impacting their quality of life. If anxiety is going up, that could be an indicator of progression of the disease or other factors, but it could also be an indicator that, say, the bells going off are a source of stress. So, but I think this is an important kind of research to do, to measure to track what the people who this technology is being used on think about it, or what their signs of well-being are before and after.
I'm going to use my moderator card here and ask a question of my own, and I think it sort of facilitates the conversation that we were just having. So in my master's research, I'm looking at the ethical implications of smart home technology. And some of the research that I've come across and that I was hoping to field to Frank and Bruce is, how do you actually come up with the technology? Do you talk to the people who are going to be using the technology first to figure out what they're looking for, how they want what they would like when they're at the Bruyère Institute or when they're living in a smart home? Or is it something that the engineers and physicians propose and then bring to the people who are going to be using it a little bit later on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll be honest. It starts with, research starts with an idea and an application for a grant. So, I mean, I have in a lot of clinical experience. Obviously, I've been, I had been taking care of older adults for 15 years by the time that we applied, for the first amount of grant to get money for smart home technology. So, I mean, I have talked to patients, I've talked to caregivers and that kind of thing. So I had an idea, but initially, for sure, the things were generated, the clinical challenges were generated by me, and the technological solutions were looked for by the engineering part of our team. But things evolve, and we evolve with the times, and we had more money, and we were able to be more flexible. And so actually the system that Bruce described came from a request by the local dementia society. So we actually went to the dementia society, said, look, if we could build something that could make a difference, like within 6 months, what would it be? And that they were actually the ones who said, look, the thing that scares us the most is at night when we're asleep, that our partner or our family member will wander out of the home. So, can you do something about that? And so we did try to come up with a system that would, do both, would guide the person living with dementia, hopefully to where they were needing to go, but also to provide the sleep relief to the caregiver. So we sort of saw it as a sort of a double barrel shotgun success if we could get both right. And and now we do have, as part of SAM3, we do have a community advisory committee. So we actually, these are including older adults themselves, as well as caregivers, both institutional caregivers, as well as, personal care, family member or those kind of caregivers as well. So we do have a community advisory committee now. Bruce, do you want to add?
No, I think that covers it very well. I guess as an engineer, I really don't get excited about technologies looking for problems. I like hearing the challenges and the end users with the perspective of the need, and then figure out are there ways that it would be solvable with technology being a tool versus I'm a techno geek and I admit it. Everything should be solved with technology is not my actual view.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. I do notice the time we're at 12:55. We've got 2 questions, so maybe we could, I think one of them is a comment and one of them might be more of a question. So hopefully we can get through these 2. So the next one is from Pam. It's more of a comment. So they say, this is so interesting to me and so many aspects to consider. Not a question, but a couple of comments. It would be interesting to do a long-term study of how acceptance, and personal choice about technology might change over the next 10 to 20 years, or even to speak to younger generations, those in their 50s, to get their view on this. Personal choice can never be lost.
I think there's an absolute generational question. We can get into a debate about, I'll say, informed consent, but the reality is the technology my parents grew up with versus the technology my kids are working with, and sort of the acceptance in some deep internal way of experience of being out there on social media is completely different in the 2 communities. We can debate all kinds about whether or not they're informed about what they're exposing. That's a different debate. But I absolutely think there's going to be generational shifts of what people think is acceptable, right? And versus informed and understanding what's acceptable, because that's different. Because I don't think anybody is really informed about what they shared with Facebook, other than learning 5 years later of what bad things could be done with it.
Okay, and last question here, I'll read fast, so let's see if I can do it. It's from Jim. So they say, keeping people at home longer through age technology sounds wonderful for most people, but if the community/transportation services aren't in place, there would be a lack of socialization and quality of life. Question. On one of the slides included in the age tech can reduce the burden on family, but the information it produces by minute by minute, which might generate knee-jerk reactions rather than comparing information month to month. Wouldn't age tech potentially result in adult children being helicopter type overseers?
So failing age tech will. I think that's I see that as one of the fundamental research questions that we need to figure out in what ultimately will be successful age tech, which is data. The way I describe the issue is if you've been on the desert island and have no clue what the news is, and I asked you what's going on in the stock market, you don't know. If you've been handed the detailed financial post of the 6-point font stock market reports of the day, you have all of the data and you still don't know, right? So you can actually drown somebody in data and they still actually don't know what's going on. getting to that right middle answer of what is important to get told and who gets told is an important end goal. And I don't know the answer to it yet. That's one of the questions Frank and I talk about as being, where we got to, where we as a team have to go next.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, this part of what we've been sort of talking about all along, right, is the question of who consents to what, right? And if the older adult says, I'm willing to give my children access to my data once a week, so on Saturday morning they can check in how the week went, then maybe that's how the data becomes accessible versus, continuous data on this, right? Or alerts, right? That when something goes wrong. So, I mean, you want a system that can provide an alert when bad things happen, and there's been consent that notification is allowed to happen. But so what the right frequency of data is, what the amount of information is, all those are outstanding questions, and they are outstanding questions as well. And thank you, Jim, for bringing that in, because we know all about helicopter parents, and now we have helicopter children to worry about because they like the tech and they've lived with the tech much more than their parents have.